Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Since Israel's inception, the survival of the Jewish state has been threatened time and again. In response to vocal aspirations to bring about its destruction, Israel has obtained nuclear weapon capabilities that for years have deterred regional enemies from realizing their damning aspirations. To further discuss Israel's deterrence and its use of nuclear weapons, among others to do so, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Emily Landau, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies.
Hi.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Ze'ev, Hannin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding also in light of the latest publishing from The New Yorker discussing the matter of Israel's nuclear capabilities and so on.
Israel has been walking a fine line for almost 60 years now regarding its nuclear weapon project. Ever since late 1960, actually in the handover between the Eisenhower and the Kennedy administrations, when the work at Dimona was exposed first inside the American administration and then via the New York Times to the world, Israel has tried to keep a very ambiguous stance, whereby it does not deny that it has some options because it wants to keep its adversaries guessing, but it also refrains from demonstrating or testing whatever it has in store, thereby assuring that the United States, especially the US Congress, does not come out against it. And ever since 1969, when Golda Meir met Richard Nixon in September of that year and reached an understanding by which Israel will keep quiet about whatever it has and the United States will no longer try to send inspectors there and will sell conventional arms to Israel so that Israel will feel powerful and secure enough so that it never feels that it must display or employ such weapons. Both American presidents and Israeli prime ministers have had a working relationship by which this commitment was kept. Now, ever since Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister for the first time in the late 1990s, he wanted to keep, to upgrade this commitment from an oral one, although of course there are minutes kept in vaults in Washington and in Jerusalem, but it has never been put in writing, and he wanted then President Clinton to write him a memo regarding it, and later presidents did it too. The New Yorker article has to do with the effort on Netanyahu's part to get such a commitment from President Trump at the very early stages of this administration, when the staffers there had no idea what Israel was talking about.
Dr. Landau, Avner Cohen, who is a nuclear historian at the Middlebury Institute, stated that in 1967, Israel had already obtained 3 nuclear weapons. Since then, nobody actually knows, and there are no public records on the matter of the capacity of Israel on the nuclear front or the alleged nuclear capacity. To what degree is Israel concerned about revealing its capabilities with regard to nuclear weapons when, at the same time, it quite frankly seems like everybody actually knows that Israel is a nuclear power state?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure where Avner Cohen got his information that he knows that Israel had 3 bombs at that time, right? Israel has a policy of nuclear ambiguity, and that information is not released. Although information has hit the international media, and we saw over the years reports, first it was 12, then it was 40, then we had the Vanunu episode where the numbers jumped to 100 to 200. The most authoritative number right now rests at about 80, and this is reported by SIPRI, which they have a lot of authority in terms of military balances of the world and of the Middle East. I think it's important to understand that Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity is not fundamentally about keeping a secret. It's fundamentally about keeping a low profile in the nuclear realm. So that in the late 1960s, the policy of ambiguity was born indeed in that meeting between Golda Meir and Richard Nixon, two new leaders, by the way, in Israel and in the United States, and their understanding that the United States would let up with the pressure on Israel to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. These were the years in which it was open for signature, and the United States had a strong interest that Israel join. Golda Meir got to the point where she understood that if she doesn't explain to the new American president why Israel can't join, we'll have a problem. So she went. They came to this arrangement whereby they will let up the pressure and Israel will keep a low profile. Obviously, no testing, no demonstrations, no talking even about this issue, obviously, no threats. And what I argue in an article recently published in a collection in the United States, an article on this model of nuclear ambiguity. Israel, it's a unique model. Israel's the only nuclear state, assumed nuclear state, that has a model of ambiguity. It's actually a model that has served strategic stability in the Middle East. The fact that Israel keeps a low profile, that Israel doesn't talk about it, is good for the region. It doesn't push other states in the region to go in that direction. And indeed, all the other states that have made the moves in the nuclear realm, they have not been in response to Israel. It hasn't been about Israel. It's often misconstrued as a response to Israel, but of course Iran and Iraq both started because of a Gulf dynamic. Mm-hmm. And therefore, this policy has actually, as I said, served strategic stability in the Middle East. It's something that's widely recognized as quite legitimate. And, if you look at the different nuclear states around the world, it's hard to think of a state that has more justification for a deterrent. And remember, it's a special category of deterrent. It's only a deterrent against an existential threat. So Israel has been involved in lots of wars in the Middle East, but they've all been fought conventionally. Israel doesn't bring the nuclear issue into the equation. And again, that's a good thing. But as a final insurance policy against an existential threat, it's hard to think of a candidate with more justification for such a deterrent than Israel.
Professor Hannin, talking about Israel's responsible actions. Obviously, since the Yom Kippur War, Israel has not faced an existential threat by definition. Yet during that time, even though, according to various reports, it did have nuclear weapon capabilities, it still decided not to use those capabilities. And as Dr. Landau has stated, it resorted only to conventional warfare in all capacities of the different conflicts that it had to deal with. To what degree does this actually provoke countries to view this capability as a deterrent, considering the fact that Israel is really that responsible? And would this actually bring Israel into a capacity of wanting to raise its profile as a nuclear weapon, a country of nuclear weapon capabilities, or will it continue in the same line?
Well, first of all, we know that acknowledging or not confirming the fact of existence of obtaining of nuclear weapon in the hands of Israel did not prevent Israel to have the nuclear doctrine that Amir explained. In fact, it was pretty clear to everybody here in the region and the world over that Israel will behave as a responsible member of the international community, and will not be the country which will use the nuclear weapon, whether it exists or not, the first in the Middle East. And at least will not use it proactively, meaning to reach some strategic goals. It's just used the same idea that Israel might have nuclear weaponry as a last argument when the question will come in concern of the very existence of the state of Israel. So we're talking about the Israel security, and it was pretty clear to everybody, including our enemies here and their patrons, like the Soviet Union, first of all, and then Russia, and maybe some other new subjects that come here in the Middle East, that Israel will not make a problem in this case. It's also clear that countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt started to speak about obtaining the nuclear armament only when the issue rose of having of nuclear weapon that might be developed by Iran. So as far as Israel is concerned, they didn't see a problem. And as far as the superpower are concerned, okay, Americans did what they did, but at the end of the day, they accepted the Israeli approach. But also the Soviet Union, they never really raised the question of having Israel obtaining the nuclear weaponry just in the propaganda. In some points here and there, in the official declarations of the Soviet Union and United Nations, here and there, in some local newspapers, they were talking about the new countries that are trying to break the treaty or not spreading of the nuclear armament treaty and so on and so forth. But in fact, they didn't have any problem with that. Also, Russia that inherited the place of the Soviet Union as a potential world superpower, like Mr. Putin likes to say it, of course, today Russia is not, of course, the first country in the world, but naturally not the second. So from this point of view, they didn't have any problem with the Israeli nuclear program, whether it exists or not. For the first time, Mr. Putin raised this question about 5 years ago. I witnessed this historical news, a new approach in the Landau Forum, where they bring experts on Russia politics and from all over the world. And I was in a small Israeli team when Mr. Putin astonished everybody was by saying that we have a new understanding about the nuclear problem in the Middle East. The whole Middle East should be nuclearly free, including Israel. So
a statement that was adopted also by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
Absolutely.
So
and
so
then they started the new round of discussing and understanding this issue. It was pretty clear at that time that Mr. Putin meant his closest ally, Iran. As far as Israel is so proactive, not in developing its own nuclear armament and not showing this nuclear armament as a first argument, not the last argument, but preventing other subjects in the Middle East from having that. So Russia considered the issue of especially nuclear lobby in the Russian establishment, then considered different ways in order to stop Israel from doing these proactive steps concerning the stopping of their enemies here in the Middle East. At the moment, it's somehow relaxed. So at the moment, Russia doesn't raise this question. And from this point of view, I believe that the traditional Israeli nuclear doctrine again became acceptable to everybody besides Mr. Erdogan and Iranian Ayatollahs, but that's another story.
Mr. Oren.
It's a problem of dialectics because as a general proposition, of course, it is better for the world if no country has nuclear weapons. It doesn't mean that wars will end because countries will still fight conventionally. And then you have the old power equations. But at least mankind is not going to perish. However, this runs counter to the private cases of certain countries, which brings about a domino theory. Because if the Americans have it, the Soviets must have it. If the Soviets have it, the Chinese must have it. If the Chinese must have it, the Indians, the Pakistanis, and so on and so forth. So what President Kennedy tried to do was a sort of a firewall. The NPT, the non-proliferation regime, codified in a treaty, was meant to tell the have-nots, don't worry. We big powers who already have nuclear weapons will not let others impose their conditions on you by using nuclear blackmail. We will treat you as if you are us. And we will also denuclearize gradually. There will be a process. Of course, this promise has not been kept. President Obama started his first term in office by pledging to work towards a nuclear-free world, and he has gotten his Nobel Prize immediately as an advance payment, even though he never made good on his promise. So there is, every 5 years, a review conference of the NPT. And during these review conferences, Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries, or Muslim countries traditionally bring up the proposition of a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, nuclear weapon-free zone, meaning that Israel must give up its weapons. The Israeli answer to that, starting in 1980, when Foreign Minister Yitzhak Shamir was at the UN General Assembly, and he came up with the answer, fine, a couple of years after peace, after Israel signs peace with everyone, because intentions are as important as capabilities. Once all of our adversaries sign peace with us, we will also be for a nuclear-free zone. And then you have to ask, who are your enemies? Now Iran is included. At the time, it was not yet. So it is a very long process from here to a nuclear-free zone.
Dr. Landau?
Yeah, I think that you probably heard Putin about 5 years ago talking about a weapons of mass destruction free zone because this was raised actually in the context of the NPT review conference. So in 2010, there was a resolution on the Middle East that was passed at the insistence of the Egyptians. It's actually not all the Arab states. This is spearheaded by the Egyptians. Mm-hmm. It's an agenda of the Egyptian Foreign Ministry. They started back in 1995. They got a resolution onto the agenda of the NPT review conference.
Earlier, the Iraqis used to raise it
Then it was a nuclear weapon-free zone, but then it changed to be a weapons of mass destruction-free zone. So the first time that there was actually a resolution that was passed on the Middle East that included this idea was in 1995, but that was in the context of the Middle East being engaged in a peace process, okay? So it was linked to this idea of peace. Then in 2000, the idea did not continue. 2005, also not. Then came 2010, Obama, president of the U.S., talking about nuclear disarmament world over. The Egyptians understood that they had an opening to press for this idea of weapons of mass destruction free zone, which of course for the Egyptians is all about Israel and the nuclear issue. It's called a weapons of mass destruction free zone, but they want to target Israel and the nuclear issue. So a resolution was passed, and it said there needed to be a conference on a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East by the end of 2012. And thus began a dynamic. There was a facilitator appointed.
A Finnish one.
Layava, former foreign minister of Finland, who actually did an excellent job. This guy really wanted to learn the topic. He went all over the Middle East, meeting with officials and non-officials in countries all over the Middle East, trying to see whether we can get a conference on this topic going. But all his efforts crashed on the inability to agree on an agenda because the Egyptians wanted to focus only on Israel and the nuclear, whereas Israel, and by the way, some of the conveners, including I think Russia, the UK, were convinced by Israel's arguments that you don't start with the hardest thing, which is the nuclear weapons. You start by looking at the region and what's going on and working on regional relationships, because states don't acquire WMD and then you have problems. You have problems and then states acquire WMD.
Sounds like the National Rifle Association argument that guns don't kill people.
Well,
right?
in this case, it's actually true. You first have to look at the conflict situation. You have to look at how states are interacting with each other. You have to work on those relationships. If states in the region, in the Middle East, won't sit down with Israel to talk about anything, but the only thing they're willing to talk about is Israel's nuclear weapons, assumed nuclear weapons, then obviously we have a problem. So it clashed on that. For all his good efforts, Layava was not able to get that together. And in 2015, the Egyptians pushed for a really hardline proposal, which the US, UK, and Canada couldn't accept, and the idea fell, and that's why you don't hear too much about it anymore. But in 2020, it's likely to come back on the agenda.
Professor Hannin.
Well, I would say that we can accept it, your explanation, Emily, in concern of one of the groups in the Russian establishment. On the other hand, you have different diplomatic groups, as we say, normally say that still, in spite of the fact the Soviet Union and Russia have one-party system, this one-party system have a lot of entrances, So different factions might consider and might regard the issue of denuclearization of the Middle East or nuclearization of it and nuclear weaponry in the hands of Israel from different point of view. So still, we hear from different sources in Moscow and different circles that they're interested to promote the interest of nuclear cooperation between Russia and Iran. And from this point of view, they should keep the issue of nuclear bomb and nuclear armament in the hands of Israel on some level, not to let other people to forget about it. On the other hand, you have a different group of people that say that, okay, now we understand that on one hand, Russia is unable to stand in the Middle East on one leg. It needs at least, or she needs, it needs, whatever, needs at least the second one, which in the best case should be Israel, if it's not if it never happened in the Arab Sunni world. And secondly, which is even more important to my mind, that Russia is not so happy about what is going on with the Iranian interests, especially in Syria, that we learned recently. So from this point of view, I believe the Yeshua will not come from Moscow. That means Messiah will not come from Moscow, but the problem will not come.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to bring the United States into the picture again. In the article of The New Yorker, they're talking about how Obama assured Israel that he's not in any way interested in demanding its signature as a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nevertheless, time and again, we hear different confirmations about Israel's nuclear capacity from the American side rather than the Israeli side. So how mixed of a situation is this?
There are several issues which converge here. One is nuclear weapons. The other one is conventional weapons, especially fighter bombers, and keeping Israel's qualitative military edge so that it doesn't feel that it has its back to the wall and must go nuclear. Another issue is territories. There was a school of thought in Israel which said, let's withdraw from the territories, pronounce our nuclear capability, and this will be our deterrent against whoever wants to invade us. And another issue was the superpower dimension, because there was, of course, a lot of secrecy regarding nuclear information in Israel, but there was no secrecy regarding the public discourse over whether Israel should go nuclear or not, even in the early 1960s. And one of the arguments against investing so much in nuclear weapons rather than in conventional weapons, which were to win the Six-Day War, was that it will be useless, because once Israel has it and displays it, the Soviet Union is going to come to the help of the Arabs and put its nuclear deterrent against Israel's. The United States will have to side with Israel, and this could lead to a showdown between the superpowers, which almost happened during the 1973 war because of some piece of information which turned out to have been false, but this is outside of our scope. So all of these dimensions converged and made Israel very sensitive about provoking the Soviets or the Russians now. And we have seen, once the Soviet Union disappeared from the map, both Ukraine and Kazakhstan immediately denuclearized. They had nuclear weapons which were left there because of the geographical reality of having test sites and other dispositions, but they didn't want to have anything with nuclear weapons when their big neighbor is Russia. So Israel is always mindful of the Russian aspect. And during the Begin administration, when some officials in the military said, we have to deter Russia too, not only Egypt and Syria, the political echelon told them, let's keep it only in the region.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you a little bit of opportunity to voice your anticipation of where we might head from here. Dr. Landau, we'll start with you.
Well, let me just say one thing about the New Yorker article.
Shortly.
It made a big thing about the discussion with Trump and Trump not knowing and reacting a little bit, maybe in a hostile manner until they actually signed this. I think what's more important is to understand that every U.S. president, whether orally or written, in a written format, has endorsed and underscored this understanding between the United States and Israel. It's an important understanding. It's an important pillar in U.S.-Israeli strategic relations. I don't see any prospect of this changing, even with the little incident with Trump. It's an important understanding. It's part of our special relationship. But we see that many other countries actually also quite understand the situation and more or less acquiesce, even though they won't say so proactively.
Professor Hannin?
Well, I would take an example of Amir, who reminded us the story of Kazakhstan and Ukraine. They got rid of their nuclear weaponry.
And Belarus.
And Belarus, yeah. They got rid of it, not for free, but in exchange of the guarantee of their territorial integrity and security. Mm-hmm. So now from Kiev, we hear that maybe they were a little bit in a hurry. I would address this question to Israeli government.
Mr. Oren?
Well, in 1973, when Israel felt that it was in a precarious position, there were some voices in favor of going to the ultimate weapon. They didn't specify. A few years ago, I had a chance to interview Henry Kissinger about it and ask him whether there was such a strategic signal that Israel would take out whatever it had so that American reconnaissance satellites will see it, will tell the Russians to tell the Egyptians. He said it never happened. And the lesson was that Israel was a responsible government, system of government. Even in its most dire time, it never considered at the top level going nuclear.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Emily Landau, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Ze'ev Hannin for coming here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.